Sorry, I don't speak French, so my presentation will be in English. Next presentation here will be in French, I promise. My idea is that the butchers, the place in which meat is sold, is an interesting point of view to analyze the city. Because in the last 80 or 90 years, in Western cities, the butchers has changed under different points of view in many, many ways. And all these changes reflect ideologies, cultural beliefs, also religious beliefs. So I think that to analyze the city, what has happened in the city, the butchers is a good point of view. This is just a project of research. I'm completing my PhD, and after completing my PhD, probably I will start this project. And the project is a cultural history of the butchers from the 1940s or 1930s to the present. There are three different elements in this research. The first is cultural history, is the methodology. The second is food, which is my topic. My PhD is in food sociology. So food is my topic, but more specifically meat. And I will demonstrate that meat is really different from food in general. And the third element is the social environment, is the Western city, because I want to find out how the butchers has changed in the Western city, because it reflects Western ideologies. First of all, cultural history, what I mean by cultural history and what studies I draw on. Cultural history, the basic assumption is that ordinary people shape history more than their leaders. So if we study ordinary people's behavior, we can really understand social changes over the years. Cultural history is also embodied in tradition, national cultures, social ideologies, and cultural beliefs. So, to sum up, cultural history is the history of ordinary people in their everyday life. And few things are as everyday as food, because we deal with food every day. We eat every day, but also we deal with food every day. So, cultural history of food is a really interesting topic to understand historical changes. I draw on two different strands of research. The first is the German philosopher Elias, who sees in the change of food habits a process of civilization in the Western world. He says the way in which we eat testifies the way in which we are improving, we are going on. But the second strand of research is Bourdieu, the French sociologist, who sees food as a source of cultural capital. So food sometimes structures societies. Particular food habits or particular items of food are typical of dominating or dominated classes. But meat, as I said before, is quite different from food for different reasons. Basically, because meat was a living being, so it was a body, and it has always linked to national, cultural, social, religious, and sexual identities. And it has symbolized blood, masculinity, divinity, death, dead body, and power. And also, as Mennel, another sociologist, says, meat confers culinary capital. Bourdieu says that meat and food in general, but also meat, confers cultural capital. And through cultural capital, we may demonstrate that we are belonging to a higher class in comparison to other people. In some societies, eating meat in such a way means I'm richer, I'm higher than you. In other societies, it means the opposite, because each food habit refers to a precise society. And sometimes different societies have totally different way of eating meat and of creating forms of culinary capital. But meat is always linked to another topic, which is linked to Bourdieu and the other theories. This is the theory of the animal origins of meat. I also wrote an article on this because I'm really interested in how we are separating the idea of the animal, of the living animal, and the idea of meat, what we eat. We tend to separate the two images. So the animal origins of meat are meat with heads, legs, tails, each part that reminds us that once food was a living being. So sometimes we eat meat with heads, legs, and in this case, the meat we eat shows its animal origins. But sometimes we tend to hide these parts of meat. So Elias and Goody, there are many theories on it. They say we are separating the two spheres. We separate them, one of them to enjoy the other. Since the Renaissance, we are approaching meat in this different way. And there is an interesting book by Masson. Masson is a food researcher, but also a psychoanalyst. And Masson lists all the techniques we adopt to hide the animal origins of meat. In my article, I've demonstrated that there is a further step in this separation, and this is cultured meat. Cultured meat is an experimental form of meat. Is meat without meat? Is meat obtained from test tube hamburgers or totally in laboratory without any participation of animal in this creation of meat? So this is the ultimate step of this process of separation, because in this case we separate meat and the animal at the stage of production. To produce meat, we don't need animals. The third element of my project is the city. The city is interesting because in the city, a new form of selling and buying food has emerged, the mass market. Because before the city or out of the cities, food was sold in a totally different way, in a small scale, on a small scale. While in the city, the mass market has emerged. But the city is also linked to meat, because in the city, since the Renaissance, people have started separating the two spheres, the animal and meat. For example, slaughterhouses, the places in which animals are killed and slaughtered. the 1950s in Italy, but I think also in France and many other countries, slaughterhouses were in the city centers. And all the people knew where the slaughterhouses were. They were institutional places. We can meet in front of the slaughterhouses. Big readings said slaughterhouses, turn to right for the slaughterhouses. So they were institutional places, and all the people knew that at that corner there was the slaughterhouse. But since the 1970s, slaughterhouses have become no places. They have been moved out of the cities, and now we all live in cities, but we don't know where slaughterhouses are. Because we don't want to know this. Because Vial also wrote that slaughterhouses have been moved from city centers to hide the sort of dark side of human labor. We don't know, and we don't want to know where slaughterhouses are. And the demonstration of this theory is that today many alternative documentaries focus on slaughterhouses, show us what happens in slaughterhouses, but we should know what happens in slaughterhouses. Animals are killed and slaughtered, but we don't want to know. So the project is based on the fact that the butchers is a space where the Western city has represented itself over the years. And I want to analyze the butchers as a scenography. So I want to analyze it semiotically, analyzing the symbolic meanings of all the parts composing the butchers. So the methods, it's a historical analysis of first-hand documents and second-hand documents, so diaries, memoirs, but also newspapers, magazines, etc. A semiotic analysis of images of butchers and interviews with butchers, especially where this job is a family tradition, to understand the difference over the years. I've found 4 different sub-periods from the 1930s to the present. The first one is the post-war era. It was after food rationing, and meat was positively considered. In the 1940s and 50s, meat was considered as the fuel for the body, for our body. And consumers wanted to see the dead animal, because seeing the dead animal meant good quality of meat. So, touching the flesh and being aware of the origins, the animal origins of meat. And this implied that you can also park your car close to dead animals, that hanging dead animals surrounded the butchers. So a totally different approach to death, to the dead animal, but to death in general, and to meat. Because buying meat here, you couldn't ignore that meat once was a living animal. After this, in the 1960s and 70s, something different happened. The butchers, meat in general, started being seen in a different way, quite negative. So the idea that that meat was a living animal emerged. The dominant, Williams list 3 different kinds of sociological approach, the dominant, the residual, and the emergent. So the dominant way of selling and buying meat didn't change. In the 1960s and 70s, meat was still sold and bought as in the 1950s and 50s. But at an emergent level, something different happened. And this is the famous Beatles cover, in which the butcher is represented in a negative way. But there are many, many other cases in which we can see that the representation of the butcher is changing since the 1960s. The Beatles cover is from 1966. And this is really important, this caused many, many debates and protests, and the cover was cancelled the day after the publication of the album and was replaced with another cover, because emergent elements at the beginning are sometimes problematic. In the 1980s and 90s, a totally different approach to meat emerged, and even butchers change. So there is what I called the cleanup of the crime scene. While in the 1950s you can compare this to a crime scene with the carcasses, dead animals, etc. In the 1980s and 90s, because of the industrialization of the mass retailing, supermarkets, but also because of cultural changing, butchers changed. So they became an anesthetized non-place in which every sign of the animal origins of meat has been cancelled. Why this? Probably for industrialization, but we know that cultural phenomena and economic phenomena affect each other. So probably also the cultural approach of people changed in those years. And the way in which meat was sold and bought changed. So we had the packaged meat in supermarkets, and the animal origins of meat were hidden, even by words. In Italy, we tend to call leg, kitchen leg, no more leg, but fusi, with another words, to hide that, even in English, people use one word for the animal and one word for meat. Pork is meat from pig, but pig is the animal. Venison is meat from deer, but deer is the animal. So people tend to hide the animal origins of meat even by language. But in the last years, after the 1990s, with the advent of postmodern society, things are changing again. And as always happens in postmodern societies, in non-unidirectional ways, but in more complex ways. So the problem is, if separating the animal from meat is a civilizing process, as Elias said, what about the contrary? So putting together meat and the animal is an uncivilizing process. So this was in the past. Another strand of my research analyzes Nazi form of propaganda on meat. I will show 3 or 4 images from Nazi propaganda, because the Nazis used meat to defame the Jews. So they represented the kosher slaughter, for example, to say the Jews make animals suffer more than us. So they showed images of kosher slaughter to defame the Jews. And they also showed the Jewish butchers in a negative way, obviously, and to represent negatively the Jewish butcher, they represented the animal origins of meat. They represented the Jewish butcher along with the dead animal. So, for example, this is an image of Nazi propaganda relating to the ghetto in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. So they said they sell dead animals, so they are negative forms of selling meat, not as the German. So in the past, putting together the animal and meat was a symbol of negative representation, as in the German, the Nazi propaganda. But in the postmodern era, it's quite different, because as ever, we have complex phenomena and not unidirectional. For example, in the countries that are suffering from the economic crisis, the animal origin, this is a photo from Athens in Greece. The animal origins of meat have been rediscovered because they are cheapest. And many people can't afford meat, and but can afford other forms of meat like heads, legs, which are cheaper than the other forms. In Athens, the first photo is the public market. This is Athens, and this is a trendy butchers. So in this case, trendy butchers sell meat without animal origins of meat. This means, for Bourdieu, that this kind of meat is meat of the dominated class, while this meat is meat of the dominant class. So this form of meat confers what Bourdieu calls culinary capital, cultural capital. I eat meat without animal origins, and so I demonstrate that I'm belonging to a higher classes. But in other countries, something totally different is happening. These are images from Animal. Animal is a really trendy restaurant in Los Angeles. In this case, eating animal origins of meat confers culinary capital. This is a really trendy restaurant, and people eating there go there because they want to demonstrate that they belong to higher classes. So in this case, less hit by the economic crisis, for a form of provocation, selling animal origins of meat confer culinary capital. So this is my project. Probably next year I will go on, but given the context of this conference, I really think that this is an interesting point of view to analyze the city. Because if we analyze the butchers really as a piece of scenography, we can understand the changes, cultural changes, economic changes, social changes. So I think this is an interesting point of view to analyze the city. Next steps will be organizing all of this confused material and getting suggestions from you, if possible, and starting my analysis. Thank you very much.
In the south of the United States, they have a specific approach of food. By food I mean not only meat, but vegetables, cakes, fruits. And they call that food soul food. Soul food. Because food is the expression of a culture. You know, in New Orleans, for instance, the only good food you can eat is the Afro-American food. And food is considered as the expression of the very soul of this community. So they have gone very far beyond the butcher approach. You know, it's not now a butcher approach, but it is now an heavenly approach. What do you think of such an approach? Do you agree with this approach? Can you make a link with such an approach?
Yes, probably. There is also an ethnic variable that I didn't face in my presentation, but probably ethnicity plays a really important role in the ways in which meat is sold or bought. For example, in many cities in Italy, or also in Britain, different ethnicities, like people from Egypt or Morocco or Arab countries in general, are bringing new kinds of slaughtering, selling, buying and eating meat. So probably I must deal also with this ethnic, but I think what you say is really interesting, but we can explain it from an ethnic point of view. So ethnic analysis could be a good, a necessary tool to analyze postmodern cities, because postmodern cities are a mix of different cultures today. So probably ethnicity must be analyzed.
Ce qui serait bien pour répondre à votre question, en fait, c'est d'analyser l'évolution des menus chez McDonald's, où en fait il y a une ethnicisation, en fait, évidemment. Donc ça veut dire que le vrai problème, c'est l'ethnicisation, ça marche, hein, spicy, machin, à la crème Indian cream, etc., etc. Là, le vrai problème, c'est quoi? C'est the food of the world. Et en fait, c'est le slow food. C'est en fait la malbouffe, quoi. C'est ça la vraie question. C'est ça la vraie question. C'est-à-dire que, voilà, mais bon, c'est un peu...
Mais ce que j'aime, c'est l'idée de la nourriture comme expression d'une culture.
Oui, mais ça, c'est récupéré par, comment dire...
c'est récupéré.
Oui, donc ça veut dire que la culture, c'est aujourd'hui le problème, si vous voulez, de l'obésité mondiale. C'est ça quand même le problème. Dire qu'aujourd'hui, il y a des effets, des crasses, c'est tout à fait évident. Moi, je ne suis pas bourdieuxien, mais là, je suis obligé de vous le dire quand même. Effectivement, dire que c'est le Soul, l'esprit, comme dit Nietzsche, on est ce qu'on nous mange. Évidemment, aujourd'hui, on mange mal. Voilà. Voilà, pour répondre à votre question de manière un peu directe.
Parce qu'on le veut bien.
And McDonald's sells different kinds of food in each country.
Parce qu'on le veut bien.
In Italy, McDonald's is different from the
Yes,
US.
it's different, McDonald's, yes. It's very bad food. It's not food.
But in Italy,
Junk food.
Yes.